Mussolini was a unifying force for the Italian people, and they had faith in him and they had a belief in him.
He's been a writer, he's been an editor, so he knows the power of ideas, he knows the power of the written word, he knows the power of expression, and he knows how to harness it.
He talked about the solidarity of the trenches, and of course he developed a very nationalist ideology, and that appealed to many who had been dispossessed or socially dislocated by the war.
Italy had, in fact, a pretty angry population. There was a lot of dissatisfaction with the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, and there was a lot of widespread unrest.
So Mussolini made his primary appeal to those members of the population who were most socially uprooted or dislocated by the war.
Mussolini absolutely captivates his audience. I mean, he's brilliant with his use of body language and facial expressions. You know, his speeches are really something to watch.
The fascist regime used violence from the start, and Mussolini was determined to prevent any opposition.
But he was also quite aggressive, and he often clashed with teachers and his fellow pupils because he had this very sort of proud nature. He was quite grumpy, and he was always pretty violent. Benito Mussolini was an Italian politician and a journalist, but he was a bit more than that. He was actually the dictator of Italy, and he led the National Fascist Party from 1922.
In terms of Mussolini's family life, his mother Rosa was an ardent Catholic, and she made sure that her children were baptized and went to church every Sunday. She was the local school teacher, so she brought in the regular income to the family.
Mussolini's father, Alessandro, he worked as a blacksmith, and the young Benito actually helped him at the forge. And, you know, as a result, the two men became, you know, really quite close. And what Alessandro taught young Benito was all about the revolutionary leaders that he so admired. And one of them was Karl Marx.
So in terms of the influence of his father on his life, Benito certainly feared his father because he hit him to discipline him. At the same time, Mussolini looked up to his father for his ideals and for his beliefs. Mussolini as a child was quite willful. Bullying, showed signs of violence from quite a young age. He actually had some difficulties learning to speak, so there was some concern about that, although he did get over that and develop to become quite a bright child, but also quite difficult and quite badly behaved.
The young Mussolini showed signs of violence from a very young age. When he was just 10, he was actually expelled from school, not for some, you know, student prank, but for actually stabbing another student.
Benito was sent away to boarding school at Faenza that was run by Salesian monks, and he regarded that being sent away as a punishment and kind of made him feel rejected. So he did recall a lack of warmth and affection at home, and perhaps this had some bearing on his future personality as it developed.
You know, he was quite a shy boy, but he was also quite aggressive, and he often clashed with teachers and his fellow pupils because he had this very sort of proud nature. He was quite grumpy, and he was always pretty violent.
Between 1912 and 1914, Mussolini worked as editor of the newspaper of the Italian Socialist Party, Avanti. Here he developed and honed his skills in journalism. At the same time, his intransigence and his difficult nature also became clear. He was determined to use his time there to prepare the way for revolution as part of the Socialist Party.
When the Great War breaks out, what we today call World War I, Mussolini sees this as a potential start to revolution. And what he begins to do is support Italian intervention, whilst the Socialist Party is actually opposing Italy's involvement in the war. And because of this, in 1914, Mussolini is actually expelled from the Socialist Party and also an organisation called Avanti. And what he does is to start his own newspaper publication. And that is called Il Popolo d'Italia, the people of Italy.
So once he established his own newspaper, he, as an experienced journalist, had a very good sense for gauging public opinion and understanding what the people were thinking, and this helped to launch him in his political career. He actually got support for his new newspaper from Italian industrialists who would have something to benefit from Italy going to war, and he also got support from the British and French governments because they wanted Italy to join on their side, which Italy did in 1915. Mussolini was conscripted in September 1915. He remained a soldier until June 1917, when he was discharged from the army due to injury. He later used his wartime experience to his benefit, talking of his time in the trenches and very much being at one with the other soldiers. He talked about the solidarity of the trenches, and of course he developed a very nationalist ideology, and that appealed to many who had been dispossessed or socially dislocated by the war.
Italy had, frankly, a pretty angry population. There was a lot of dissatisfaction with the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, and there was a lot of widespread unrest.
As Italy had not been given all the territories that had been promised to her, she felt a wound to her national pride, and Mussolini was able to capitalize on that.
Erano chiaramente stabiliti problemi italiani nei confronti della Francia, problemi di carattere coloniale. Questi problemi hanno un nome, si chiamano uniti.
So Mussolini made his primary appeal to those members of the population who were most socially uprooted or dislocated by the war. There were some 2.5 million ex-servicemen to be reintegrated into the peacetime economy, and of course the economy was suffering too. Italy was quite unstable politically in this period, with 5 different governments between 1919 and 1922. So what Mussolini was saying was that his new party, the Fascist Party, would sort of sweep clean all the decadence and the corruption associated with the existing governments, and that he would really bring something new to the nation.
And in 1921, the Italian king, Victor Emmanuel III, he actually dissolves the parliament because there's all this kind of violence and chaos raging.
Mussolini's new party was designed to offer a third way between liberalism and Bolshevism. So it was something completely new, and there were certain key aspects of ideology associated with the Italian Fascist Party. First of all, Mussolini was determined to create a new fascist man who would lead this new nation. And absolutely central to fascist ideology was the state. So it was to be a very strong state, and one which really was a totalitarian state. A totalitarian state with complete submission to the state. So the state would control everything, not just politics and the economy, but cultural life, social life, and even intervening into everyday life and private life of the population. The black shirts were the paramilitary wing of the fascist party. By the end of 1920, there were these fascist black shirt squads, the Fasci di Combattimento.
And after 1923, you have this all-volunteer militia of the Kingdom of Italy under fascist rule. And that's quite similar to the SA, the Nazi brown shirts.
They went around in groups of between 200 and 250. The fascist squads were attacking and burning down socialist and communist headquarters, also left-wing printing presses and agricultural cooperatives and those kinds of organizations. So what the fascists were doing, therefore, was standing up for the industrialists and for the landowners against Bolshevism or communism. So there was a big fear of communist or red revolution in Italy during this time, and the fascists really seemed to be the defenders against that. So the fascist party then got a lot of support from industrialists and from landowners because they were the ones who were seeming to defend Italy against this communist threat or this perceived communist threat. Mussolini was a unifying force for the Italian people, and they had faith in him and they had a belief in him. So through his sense of vision, he sort of transmitted that to the nation. There came to be this kind of symbiotic relationship between the leader and the led.
Mussolini absolutely captivates his audience. I mean, he's brilliant with his use of body language and facial expressions. You know, his speeches are really something to watch.
Through his public appearances and through his speeches, Mussolini soon became very popular. Using his body language as well as his words, he created a cult of a leadership around him where the people very much saw him as this visionary man, and he unified the Italian people in a way that they hadn't been in the recent history before.
E vedere soprattutto un fatto nuovo nella storia dell'umanità, il popolo italiano che è il protagonista della sua storia. Ma fratelli, saranno gli anni domani.
He was a unifying figure for the nation, and he was very keen to show his prowess and his vigor. He was shown open water swimming or engaged in some of the public works. So this was all designed to create an aura around him of this great leader. By October 1922, the fascists were becoming increasingly strong, and they believed that the time was right to stage their coup, or their seizure of power.
What happens in late October 1922 is that you have the Fascist Party leaders planning an insurrection. You know, they want a revolution. Let's make no bones about that. And they want that to take place on the 28th of October. This becomes known as the March on Rome.
This March on Rome was mythologized by the fascists as a great, unstoppable force, but in fact, the reality was somewhat different. They talked about 100,000 fascists marching on Rome, but the truth was there were only 20,000, and actually they waited outside Rome for orders that never came. The fascists were able to come to power, not as a result of actually using force at that moment, but through the threat of using force.
You've got the Prime Minister, a man called Luigi Facta. He's wishing to declare a state of siege, quite understandably, but this is actually overruled by the King, Victor Emmanuel.
The King, Victor Emmanuel III, invited Mussolini to form a government and accepted his demands. So this very celebrated March on Rome in fascist mythology wasn't quite what it was made out to be.
And of course, what this means is that political power has now been transferred to the fascists without any armed conflict.
The fascist regime used violence from the start, and Mussolini was determined to prevent any opposition.
Even quite soon after gaining power, in 1925, what the fascist government does is to even make suspicion of being anti-fascist, a punishable crime, and you can be imprisoned for that suspicion alone without any trial at all. And then in 1927, Mussolini forms what's called the Organisation for Vigilance and Repression of Anti-Fascism. Actually, that's a secret police.
So he established the OVRA, which was the secret police, and that was used to track down and deal with any political opposition.
Mussolini survives 3 assassination attempts. In 1926, Violet Gibson tries to kill him on April the 7th. On October the 31st, you have a man called Anteo Zamboni trying to kill him. And then on September the 11th in 1926, you have a man called Gino Lecchetti having a go. Now, all these attempts on his life, what they do is they lead to an introduction of a new law called the Legge di Difesa dello Stato, the law for the defense of the state. Now, that is enacted on the 25th of November 1926. And this is a crucial part of Mussolini taking control, because what that law does is to dissolve all political parties, organisations, associations, you name it, anything opposed to fascism, it goes. Okay, so the new law allows those being accused of being enemies of the state to be sentenced to prison, or worse still, to death.
The Acerbo law was a key moment in Mussolini's consolidation of power.
Now, the Acerbo law stated that the party gaining the largest share of the votes, provided they got at least 25% of them, would actually gain 2/3 of the seats in Parliament. I mean, it's insane.
Ma se Dio vi riconoscessi ad uno, come vi riconoscessi?
And the purpose of it is to give Mussolini's fascists a majority of deputies. It's quite obvious. And that law was only used in the 1924 general election because, of course, that was the last proper, full, competitive election, if you like, held in Italy until 1946.
New elections were held in April 1924, after this law had come in at the end of the previous year. And using both this law as well as violence and intimidation, Mussolini very much cemented his power.
Giacomo Matteotti was an Italian socialist politician, and on the 30th of May 1924, he openly speaks in the Italian parliament, and he is saying that the fascists have committed fraud in the recently held elections, and he is denouncing the violence they've used to gain votes.
He called the results into question because of the violence and the intimidation, and really held that the election results shouldn't be valid.
Guess what happens? 11 days later, he's kidnapped and he's killed by the fascists. The murder of Giacomo Matteotti, it does cause a real stink, and you've got newspapers launching really fierce attacks on Mussolini and the entire fascist movement. And you've got all the anti-fascist parties, they're going, hang on a minute, we're just going to abandon the Chamber of Deputies. What we want to do is we want to force the crown, King Victor Emmanuel III, to act against Mussolini.
Socialist deputies and others seceded from the Italian parliament in what was known as the Aventine secession as a protest to what had happened.
Mussolini is nothing if not cunning, and what he does is to devise this counter-manoeuvre. And on the 3rd of January 1925, he gives what is now a really famous, kind of notorious speech, both attacking the anti-fascists and confirming that he, and only he, Mussolini, was the leader of fascism. And what he does is he challenges the anti-fascists to prosecute him. He says, go on, have a go. And he admits that the murderers were fascists of very high station, as he calls them. He's proud of these guys. I mean, this is what Hitler did, after Night of the Long Knives.
On the 3rd of January 1925, Mussolini made quite a famous speech, and one which was really meant to cement his position as leader. So it was both attacking anti-fascists, but also saying that as far as fascism was concerned, he was the only and the indisputable leader.
Mussolini basically sort of kind of rhetorically claims fault. And what he states is this. He says, I assume that I alone, Mussolini, the political, moral and historical responsibility for everything that has happened. And if these sentences, more or less maimed, are enough to hang a man, well then frankly, out with the noose. So, what Mussolini is concluding here is with a warning. What Italy needs is stability, and fascism is going to ensure that stability. And it's going to do so in any manner necessary. And this speech is considered the very beginning of the dictatorship in Italy.
So this made his position very plain, and his days of sort of dealing with what was left over of the liberal state came to an end, and now he was very much determined to have his one-party state and his totalitarian state.
Mussolini was a really gifted propagandist, okay? He was a journalist at heart, and he was really aware of the relationship between power and optics, the way that power is viewed. He understands completely the necessity of having the press, on side in his efforts to maintain power. He's been a writer, he's been an editor, so he knows the power of ideas, he knows the power of the written word, he knows the power of expression, and he knows how to harness it.
The fascist government introduced a number of different policies and measures, some of which gained quite a lot of popularity with the Italian people. So the party introduced youth groups, also women's groups, and also an organisation called the OND, which was the After Work organisation. So this had clubs where there were billiards tables and bars and sort of social activities. It also sponsored holidays, trips to the seaside, subsidised cultural events and so on. And this was one of the most popular aspects of fascist Italy because it introduced mass tourism and mass leisure in a way that hadn't been there before. The other policy that created quite a lot of popularity for Mussolini's regime was his Lateran Treaty, his accord with the Pope in 1929.
And what that does is officially recognises the Vatican as a sovereign state, and it also makes Catholicism Italy's official religion. Now that's a really popular decision. It's a really smart move because, of course, Italy has a predominantly Catholic population.
So this brought about a reconciliation between the Pope and the Italian state for the first time since the state had come into being in 1870. So this policy with the Church, in obviously a very predominantly Catholic country, made this regime quite popular. The regime's public works schemes and efforts to reclaim land from the sea and to put into place irrigation policies and such like also was making sure that people were at work, and that also increased the popularity of the fascist regime.
Mussolini actually starts a large number of public works which actually dramatically reduce unemployment. And what they're also designed to do is to improve infrastructure and, of course, famously, to make the trains run on time. What's commonly observed is that the Great Depression takes place and that leads to a rise in fascism. But you've got to remember that fascism was made popular by Mussolini in Italy from 1922, and then it really gained more traction after 1929. Because people looked at it and went, hang on a minute, this is one of the only forms of government that is surviving this economic collapse. People looking at fascism thinking maybe that's the way forward, not democracy.
In the early years, in terms of the international reputation of the regime, Mussolini was hailed as quite successful for these public works schemes and other policies that were sort of keeping the economy going and also the population reasonably happy. Of course, that was to change later, but at this point, I think people were saying that whatever else you could say about Mussolini, he made the trains run on time.
There were many public figures all over the world saying that Mussolini was this kind of genius. He was a kind of Superman, if you like. And his achievements, some saw as being nothing less than miraculous. What he had appeared to have done was to taken this demoralised country and to kind of transform it and kind of reinvigorate it. And he'd carried out all these social reforms and these public works, and the landowners and the industrialists, they were still on side. And he had even made a deal with the Pope. Okay, so on the surface, everything looked kind of peachy, looked all right. But if you scratch below it, nothing was quite as rosy as it seemed. Way back in 1911, when he was a young socialist, what Mussolini did was to take part in this really violent protest against Italy's invasion of Libya. But then spool forward to 1925, Mussolini is now advocating his Spazioli Vitali. You know, he is now a fully fledged expansionist. Spazio Vitale was the territorial expansionist concept of Italian fascism. You know, what Mussolini dreams of more than anything else is to build a new Roman Empire.
Spazio Vitale was a fascist concept, Mussolini's concept, for living space. So this was very similar to Hitler's concept of Lebensraum, living space. And Mussolini wanted to create a new Roman Empire and to expand Italian power. So this was always about expansion. Rather than being confined or hemmed in by the Mediterranean, Mussolini talked about making the Mediterranean our sea, the Italian sea. So a space from which the Italians could expand and gain empire. At the end of the 19th century, Italy had made some territorial acquisitions, so particularly in Somaliland and in Eritrea. The Italians had failed to take Ethiopia in 1896, and so this remained a bit of a thorn in the side of Italy, the fact that they didn't succeed in taking that land at that time. So Mussolini could use that to project, again, this concept of living space and this idea of territorial expansion by the Italians, and so to try again to take Ethiopia, and that's what he did. So he invaded Ethiopia in 1935.
Quando nel 1915 l'Italia unì le sue sorti a quelle degli alleati, quanti gridi di ammirazione e quante promesse, ma dopo la vittoria comune alla quale l'Italia aveva portato il supremo contributo di 670.000 morti, 400.000 mutilati, 1 milione di feriti. Quando si venne attorno al tavolo della esosa pace, a noi toccarono soltanto le briciole dell'auto bottino coloniale altrui.
In October 1935, Italian troops invade Ethiopia. And this is seen as an example of this expansionist policy that is kind of characterising what the Axis powers are going to do.
Italy invaded Ethiopia in October 1935, and Mussolini's justification for this was the need for Italy to have living space.
Abbiamo pazientato mentre si stringeva attorno di noi sempre più rigido il cerchio e vuole soffocare la nostra irrompente vitalità. O l'Etiopia Abbiamo pazientato 40 anni, ora basta!
The Italian military forces actually went against international law as outlined in the Geneva Protocol of 1925.
Italian military forces used something like 300 to 500 tons of mustard gas to attack both kind of military targets and even more horrifically civilian targets. Italy was a signatory to the 1925 Geneva Protocol that banned gas, but Mussolini just didn't care. And there are some estimates that say around 1/3 of Ethiopian casualties of Mussolini's invasion were caused by gas.
Ladies and gentlemen, the second speaker on the list is His Majesty Negus Haile Selassie. I call upon the first delegate of Ethiopia.
Monsieur le Président, Monsieur le... እኔ ቀዳማዊ ኃይለ ሥላሴ የኢትዮጵያ ንጉሠ ነገሥት የዛሬ 8 ወር 50 መንግስታት የዓለምን መንግስታት ሕግ የተላለፈ የአጥቂነት ጦርነት መደረጉን ምክንያቱም ወታደሮቹ ቦምቡ በወደቀ ጊዜ ጋዙን ነፋስ እስኪወስደው ድረስ መበታተኑን ስላወቁበት ነው። ዘራቸውንም ለማጥፋት አደጋ እየጣለ ወጋቸው።
In response to all the appeals from the Ethiopians, the League of Nations actually condemns the Italian invasion in 1935 and it votes to impose economic sanctions on Italy. But these sanctions are really ineffective because there's just a general lack of support.
Italy's invasion of Ethiopia was a blow to the principle of collective security represented by the League of Nations and to international stability.
And what it also exposes is this dreadful ineffectiveness of the League of Nations before the outbreak of the Second World War. That organisation simply cannot stand up to the dictators. Mussolini just looked at the League of Nations and kind of laughed them off. I mean, just dismissed them. There were no repercussions. And what this also does, crucially, it shows Mussolini's fellow dictator, Adolf Hitler, that the League of Nations has got basically no power at all. In fact, what happens is all these tariffs, all these sanctions that are imposed on Italy by other nations because of the invasion, actually it increases Mussolini's popularity. In May 1936, you got more than 30 million people celebrating the victory on the streets of Italy. This is a huge sign of Mussolini's increased power, increased popularity, and the war also saw the creation of a new military rank. And that was called Field Marshal of the Italian Empire. And of course, he awarded that to himself and also to the king. And so therefore, he's sort of kind of making himself as Prime Minister the same rank, theoretically, as the king himself.
At home, the invasion of Ethiopia and the successful war there made Mussolini's regime even more popular and made Mussolini himself even more popular. So in 1936, millions of Italians took to the streets to celebrate this victory. This was a foreign policy success that just contributed to the whole aura that surrounded Il Duce, the leader.
It's fair to say that Mussolini's invasion doesn't really gain him a lot of popularity amongst other nations. And in fact, it comes as no surprise to learn that the only nation that doesn't oppose Italy's invasion is Nazi Germany.
Mussolini could be conceived as something of a political chameleon because he changed quite a lot over time. So he started out his political life as a socialist, but he was also influenced by syndicalism and by anarchism. And then he founded his Italian Fascist Party. And then later on, even within that, his policies changed as the Italian fascist state became closer to Hitler's Nazi regime. And then we can see that his policies became much more influenced by Hitler.
Now, in the late 1920s, Mussolini is providing some financial support to the Nazi Party as it continues its rise. And what he had also done is to allow brown shirts, the SA, and even SS men to train with his own paramilitary brigade. Those are the black shirts, of course. And Mussolini views the rise of the Nazi Party as something that's affirming his own ideology. This is saying, fascism's on the march. It's not just Italy, it's Germany next, and who knows where else. In private, however, Mussolini's really quite scornful of Hitler and his Nazis. The Italian leader describes Mein Kampf as boring. Actually, he was right. And he thought that Hitler's ideas and theories were kind of coarse and simplistic. And indeed, Mussolini is dead right here. In his early years, when he was leading the Nazi Party, Hitler was a big admirer of Mussolini. The Nazi leader was particularly fascinated by Mussolini's march on Rome, and this is a very kind of influential moment for Hitler.
He looked upon the march on Rome as something to be admired, and in fact staged his own coup, or tried to, in November 1923, following the example of Mussolini.
But let's not forget, Mussolini's prone to his own personal kind of egomania, and he's got a low opinion of Hitler's kind of rise to power, which he thinks is far less glorious than his own. Even though they're both fascist dictators, the first meeting that takes place between Mussolini and Hitler, which is in Venice in June 1934, was frankly a bit of a disaster.
So Mussolini turned up with his knowledge of German without, therefore, bringing a translator and assuming he'd be fine.
Mussolini only speaks a little bit of German, and he was too arrogant to use a translator. And he had a lot of difficulty in understanding Hitler's kind of somewhat rough and coarse Austrian accent. And then what Mussolini is subjected to are these huge, notorious Hitler long, boring monologues. And Mussolini was so bored.
He was also listening to all these ideologies that Hitler was espousing and not particularly impressed.
There's a big difference between Mussolini and Hitler, and that lies in their racial views. Mussolini, let's face it, like Hitler, did think that white Europeans were the kind of architects of culture and civilization. But, what Mussolini doesn't share with Hitler is this kind of hateful and eliminationist anti-Semitism. What Mussolini was an Italian nationalist first and foremost, and what he's doing is harking back to the glories and triumphs of ancient Rome. So he's really pretty scornful of Hitler's rants about Aryan supremacy. It's not really Mussolini's bag, if you like. And in one speech, the Italian leader is actually expressing kind of pity for the racial views being kind of expressed by the Nazis. He's looking at them and going, these people are, in his words, the descendants of those who are illiterate when Rome had Caesar and Virgil and Augustus. He kind of thinks the Germans are inferior in some way.
Noi possiamo parlare con un sovrano disprezzo. Talune dottrine d'altralbe di gente che ignorava la scrittura con la quale tramandare i documenti della propria vita in un tempo in cui Roma aveva Cesare, Virgilio ed Augusto.
And so both men kind of walk out of Venice, this summit, thinking, yeah, I don't think much of that guy. Mussolini then pays a state visit to Germany in September 1937, and where he's met with a really long, vast parade of troops, and there's military equipment paraded, artillery, you name it. And these shows of strength were really obvious. They were there to kind of impress Mussolini, and you know what? It worked.
They came to see the commonalities of their ideologies and indeed of their policies and what could be gained by becoming closer together. And in 1936, they formed the Rome-Berlin axis, so coming closer together. And that was cemented into the Pact of Steel, which was a formal alliance in 1939. By the late 1930s, we can see something of a shift in the relationship between Mussolini and Hitler, and we see Mussolini being much more heavily influenced by Hitler in a number of ways. So this could be seen by the introduction of a series of reforms to the way behaviour took place. So, for example, that the Italian forces were obliged suddenly to goose step, that civil servants were obliged to wear military uniform for the first time. So those kinds of things showing the closeness of the Italian regime to Hitler's, and just a kind of change in manners, a change in the way of behaviour in the Italian state, heavily influenced by Hitler. And this came to the fore in 1938 with the racial laws adopted by Mussolini's Italy.
They restrict the civil rights of Italian Jews, they ban books written by Jews, and they exclude Jews from public offices and even higher education. By the state, this is anti-Semitism. And there are more and more laws stripping Jews their assets, restricting their travel, and finally, it even puts them into internal exile. It kind of treats them as political prisoners. But what Mussolini is not doing is systematically murdering Italy's Jews in the way that Hitler does with his Jews, if you like.
So in 16 years before a fascist power, there had not been any racial laws. And suddenly at this point, because he was showing his closeness and proximity to Hitler, and because he was heavily influenced by Hitler, Mussolini introduced a series of racial laws that were not too dissimilar to the Nuremberg laws in Nazi Germany.
Coloro i quali fanno credere che noi abbiamo obbedito a imitazioni o peggio a suggestioni sono dei poveri deficienti problema ebraico, pone dunque che un aspetto di questo fenomeno. La nostra posizione è stata determinata da questi incontestabili dati di fatto. L'ebraismo mondiale è stato durante 16 anni, malgrado la nostra politica, un nemico irreconciliabile del fascismo.
Good evening, everybody. Tonight, it seems clearly apparent that the first great phase of the war in the West has been won by Germany. The army of French and British has made a valiant battle in its effort to retreat to Dunkirk, where there is some slight chance that some part of it can be evacuated.
Adolf Hitler's mechanized forces are racing toward Paris as French resistance collapses.
This was a war that Hitler wanted. He was an out-and-out aggressor. And of course, the first months of the war were very successful for Germany, with the Blitzkrieg lightning strike on Poland, and then very quick successes in the West.
Mussolini is watching the progress of Hitler with actually quite a lot of jealousy. He's a bit bitter, to be honest. You know, and as he sees each fresh German victory, he gets more and more livid. And he's starting to express the hope that maybe the Germans will be slowed down or feel a little bit better. You know, we don't like it when our friends are too successful. And this is what's going on here. But Germany, of course, just advances westward, you know, and not only takes all the Low Countries, but even, you know, takes France. And when France is on the verge of collapse, you know, Mussolini felt he can't delay any longer. So then on June the 10th, 1940, there's this fateful declaration of war.
La dichiarazione di guerra è già stata consegnata agli alleati. Gli ambasciatori di Gran Bretagna e di Francia. Popolo italiano, corri alle armi e dimostra la tua tenacia. Il tuo coraggio, il tuo valore.
It's apparent by 1943 that Italy's military position is simply untenable. You know, you've got the Axis forces in North Africa being finally defeated in the Tunisian campaign, and that's in early 43. And then you've also got Italian involvement on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union. Setbacks are happening there as well. And then, to make matters worse for Mussolini, the Allies then invade Sicily. So, you know, you've got the invasion of, you know, Italy on its own doorstep, if you like. You know, the Italian home front is in a bad way because you've got the Allies bombing, and of course, you know, bombing campaigns take their toll. You know, factories are being brought to standstill. You've got raw materials, a stranglehold on them, coal and oil. You know, those are all starting to run very short. And on top of that, you've also got a shortage of food, and the food that is available is being, you know, is grossly overpriced, and you've got this kind of black market of incredibly expensive food. And of course, the result of this is going to be huge discontent. So by March 1943, you've got strikes taking place in the north, which is the Italian industrial heartland. Mussolini is in trouble, make no doubt about it. Italian surrender in North Africa in 43, the Germans begin to take precautions. They look at Italy and think it's going to collapse. You know, what Mussolini has done is grossly exaggerated the extent of his public support, you know, for his regime and indeed for the war itself.
As the war years progressed, Mussolini's popularity with the Italian people declined. And the reason for this was that Italy was more and more dependent on Nazi Germany.
You've got this German presence in Italy, and that starts to turn public opinion against Mussolini even more. And you know, when the Allies invade Sicily, you know, the Sicilians, you know, look at the Allies and go, these people are liberators, they're not invaders.
Between the 24th and 25th of July, 1943, Mussolini was removed from government through a vote of no confidence.
This is the downfall of Il Duce. And by this time, you know, discontent with him is absolutely widespread and intense. And when the news of his downfall is announced on the radio, there's no resistance to it. You know, people rejoice because they think that actually what the end of Mussolini also means is the end of war.
By the last days of 1945, Mussolini could see that the end was near.
On the 28th of April 1945, Mussolini is shot dead by partisans in the north of Italy. It's a really ignominious end. Mussolini was in no doubt that the end was coming. I mean, he was trying to flee before the 28th of April 45. You know, he was on the run. He was desperate. He was running for his life. The day after Mussolini is killed, on the 29th of April 1945, his corpse and that of his mistress, Clara Petacci, they're dragged along and they're dumped on the ground in front of the old Piazzale Loreto.
And there was some important symbolism to the location because this was where a few months earlier the Nazis had carried out some bloody reprisals on Italian partisans.
And they're kicked and they're spat upon, and then the bodies are then hung upside down from the roof of an Esso petrol station. And then the bodies are then stoned. I mean, it's kind of endless abuse of these corpses by civilians. The reason for this is simple. I mean, it's kind of done as a very public display of discouragement. It's saying to other fascist black shirts, you know, you've got to end the fight, otherwise this is what's going to happen to you. And of course, it's also an act of revenge because so many partisans were hanged in that same place by the Axis authorities. One man who sees what happens to Mussolini's corpse and learns from it is, of course, Adolf Hitler. And it's the abuse of Mussolini's corpse that leads Hitler to make a decision to actually kill himself, you know, a few days later.